The year was 1861. Fort Bowie, in what is now southeastern Arizona, lay under a silence no experienced soldier ever trusted. Colonel Bernard Cross had fought in the Mexican Wars, survived 3 Sioux ambushes, and faced down Texas bandits without flinching. But when the wind stopped blowing that September afternoon, and even the scorpions seemed to have fled the rocks, he felt something he had never known in 20 years of military service. Pure fear. Primitive. Visceral. Because Cross knew what that silence meant. The Apaches were there, somewhere. And when they chose to strike, there would be no time to shout, to pray, or to run. There would only be blood, sand, and stories other soldiers would later tell in hushed voices, eyes wide with terror. This is not a legend, not a myth exaggerated by frontier gossip or military propaganda. This is the documented history of the most feared people encountered by every army that set foot in the American Southwest between the 17th and 19th centuries, a warrior nation that turned a hostile desert into an impenetrable fortress. The Apache were not merely warriors, they were tactical phantoms, masters of invisibility, experts in psychological warfare long before the term ever existed. They made entire patrols of trained soldiers vanish without a trace. They killed sentries without a sound. They stole horses from inside guarded forts, and they vanished into the desert like smoke. For nearly 300 years, Spanish, Mexican, and American forces tried to conquer Apache territory. They sent armies, they built forts, they offered bounties. But the Apache did not merely resist, they terrorized empires. The story begins long before school books are willing to admit, long before names like Cochise and Geronimo became legends. It begins with the people who understood the desert not as an enemy, but as an ally. A land that killed invaders and protected those who knew its secrets. Apache territory stretched across a brutal landscape, jagged mountains, arid deserts, treacherous canyons, and plains that seemed endless beneath a sun that melted the sanity of men. Where European colonizers saw a hell to be tamed, the Apache saw home. They were born running. Apache children learned to ride before they fully learned to walk. They learned to track before they learned to read. By the age of 10, a young Apache could follow the trail of a rabbit for miles across solid rock, identify which animal had passed through an area by scent alone, and survive 3 days in the desert with nothing but a knife and their wits. But their training went far beyond physical survival. The Apache developed a system of warfare that was, by the standards of the time, revolutionary. While European armies marched in rigid formations, wearing bright uniforms and announcing their arrival with drums, the Apache moved like shadows. They did not believe in honorable, open-field battles where 2 armies faced each other directly. To them, that was foolish suicide. They believed in efficiency, in killing the enemy without giving him the chance to strike back, in disappearing before reinforcements could arrive, in turning fear into a weapon as powerful as any arrow or rifle. Apache tactics were so advanced that modern militaries still study them today. Small groups of warriors, never more than 15 or 20, moved quickly and left no tracks. They knew every water source, every hidden mountain passage, every cave that could serve as shelter. When they attacked, it was always at the enemy's most vulnerable moment. At dawn, when soldiers still fought sleep. During sandstorms, when visibility dropped to nothing. Or inside narrow canyons, where there was nowhere to run. But what truly terrified the Apache's enemies was not just their combat skill, it was their ability to simply disappear. Eyewitnesses, soldiers, traders, survivors reported the same impossible story. Apache warriors who seemed to dissolve into thin air. One account from 1847, written by Mexican Lieutenant Francisco Hidalgo, describes a patrol of 20 soldiers pursuing a group of 5 Apache warriors across an open valley. The Apache were less than 200 meters away. There were no trees, no large rocks, only sand and low brush. Hidalgo blinked, When he opened his eyes, the 5 warriors were gone, completely. He and his men searched the valley for 3 hours. They found nothing, no footprints, no sign. 2 days later, the same 5 warriors attacked Hidalgo's camp at night. They killed 6 soldiers, stole every horse, and vanished once again. Hidalgo never discovered how they did it. The truth, never fully revealed by the Apache, involved camouflage techniques that seemed impossible. They used the natural colors of the desert to cover their bodies entirely, not just their faces, but every inch of exposed skin. They crawled when necessary, merging with the landscape itself. But there was more. The Apache trained to control their breathing, to move without sound, even over loose stone, to choose routes where the sun would be behind them, blinding anyone who looked their way. They did not disappear by magic. They understood physics, light, shadow, and human perception better than any army of their era. And they used that knowledge to create terror. Because the Apache understood something fundamental about war. Killing 100 enemies is efficient, but making 1,000 enemies afraid to sleep is strategic. The Spanish were the first to learn this lesson firsthand. When they expanded north into what is now Mexico in the 17th century, they encountered the Apache and quickly realized these were not Indians like those they had subdued farther south. The Apache did not submit. They did not negotiate for scraps. They did not accept Catholic missions or bow to distant viceroys. They attacked, destroyed, and vanished, leaving missions in ruins and colonies abandoned. In 1680, the Apache and allied tribes led the Pueblo Revolt, a coordinated uprising that completely expelled the Spanish from New Mexico for 12 years. 12 years. Let that sink in. A European colonial superpower was driven out of an entire territory by indigenous warriors. When the Spanish returned, they came with a new strategy. They built a line of forts, the presidios, to contain the Apache. They offered bounties for scalps. They attempted to form alliances with other tribes to isolate them. They sent punitive expeditions. The Apache simply adapted their tactics. If the forts were heavily garrisoned, they attacked isolated ranches. If the ranches were fortified, they struck caravans on the roads. If the caravans traveled with military escorts, the Apache followed them for days until the soldiers lowered their guard. It was a war of attrition, and the Apache were very, very good at it. One of the most shocking accounts comes from 1776, the same year as American independence. The governor of the Spanish province of Sonora, Juan Bautista de Anza, wrote to the viceroy of New Spain describing the state of his territory. In less than 20 years, the Apache had destroyed more than 400 ranches, killed thousands of settlers, and forced the abandonment of entire mining operations. De Anza wrote, "They appear from where there is nothing. They kill like storms. And when we seek revenge, we chase only the wind." This was not political rhetoric or bureaucratic exaggeration. It was the real despair of a colonial governor administering a province where settlers lived in constant terror, where families were found massacred in their own homes, where children vanished from the fields, and where the simple act of traveling between towns meant accepting the possibility of death. The Mexicans inherited the Apache problem when they won independence from Spain in 1821, but they also inherited Spanish arrogance, the belief that brute force could solve the Apache. In 1835, the Mexican state of Chihuahua implemented one of the most brutal policies in the history of the Americas, an official bounty on Apache scalps. 100 pesos for the scalp of a warrior, 50 for the scalp of a woman, 25 for the scalp of a child. The intention was clear: genocide. Total extermination. Professional scalp hunters began hunting Apache like animals. Men such as James Kirker and John Glanton grew wealthy by delivering sacks filled with bloody scalps to Mexican authorities. But the Mexicans made a fatal mistake. They underestimated Apache memory. The Apache did not forget, they did not forgive, and they did not leave crimes unanswered. It was within this blood-soaked context that one of the most feared leaders in Apache history emerged, Mangas Coloradas. His name means red sleeves, supposedly from the blood of his enemies staining his clothing after battle. Mangas was not born a war leader. He was born in the late 18th century into a relatively peaceful Mimbreño Apache band. He was exceptionally tall for an Apache. Witnesses claimed he stood nearly 6'6", a rarity that gave him an imposing physical presence. For years, Mangas tried to maintain peace with the Mexicans. He negotiated treaties. He honored agreements. He kept his band away from conflict whenever possible. And then, in 1837, everything changed. Mangas and several members of his band were invited to a peace banquet in the town of Santa Rita del Cobre, in what is now New Mexico. Mexican authorities guaranteed safety. They promised honest negotiations. They served food and drink. It was a trap. When the Apache were relaxed, eating, and unarmed, Mexican soldiers opened fire. It was a planned massacre. Dozens of Apache were killed. Men, women, elders, children. Their scalps were cut off and sold to the government of Chihuahua. Mangas survived, barely. He watched members of his own family gunned down. He saw friends executed while begging for mercy. He saw the blood of his people soak into the earth as Mexican soldiers laughed and cut scalps as if harvesting corn. Something broke inside him that day, or perhaps something awakened. The man who walked away from Santa Rita del Cobre was no longer a leader seeking coexistence. He was a force of nature, fueled by pure hatred and a thirst for vengeance. Over the next 20 years, Mangas Coloradas became a living legend of terror. He united multiple Apache bands under his leadership, an extremely rare achievement among a fiercely independent people. He organized coordinated attacks against Mexican settlements on a scale never seen before. Mexican testimonies from the period describe entire villages wiped off the map, families disappearing overnight, caravans attacked with military precision, mines burned with workers still inside. Mangas did not strike randomly. Every attack was calculated. He maintained a network of informants, Apache living peacefully in Mexican towns, feeding him information on troop movements, trade routes, and vulnerable locations. It was organized espionage decades before the American Civil War. A Mexican military report from 1842 admits something astonishing. The state of Sonora had lost more than 2,000 settlers to Apache attacks in just 5 years. Hundreds of ranches were abandoned. Entire towns were evacuated. Mexico's northern frontier was collapsing, and the Mexican government could do nothing to stop Mangas Coloradas. They sent punitive expeditions. Mangas lured them into mountain ambushes, where infantry soldiers stood no chance against mounted warriors who knew every trail. They tried to negotiate. Mangas attended talks, listened to the proposals, laughed, and walked away. They placed bounties on his head, 500 pesos, then 1,000, then 3,000. No one managed to kill him, and those who tried became examples. In 1846, a professional scalp hunter named James Johnson believed he could deceive Mangas. Johnson had a notorious reputation. He was known for inviting Apache groups to trade, getting the warriors drunk on whiskey, and then massacring them while they were vulnerable. Johnson attempted the same trick with Mangas. He invited his band to negotiate, offered alcohol, prepared an ambush, but Mangas was far more intelligent than Johnson's previous victims. He sent only a few young warriors to the negotiation, while the rest of his band surrounded Johnson's camp from all sides, hidden among the rocks. When Johnson gave the signal for his men to attack, the Apache were already waiting. The ambush turned into a counter-ambush. Of Johnson's 18 scalp hunters, only 3 survived, and only because Mangas deliberately allowed them to live so they could spread the story. Johnson's body was found 3 days later by Mexican soldiers. His scalp had been taken, his tongue cut out, and carved into his forehead with a knife was a message in Spanish: liar. The Apache learned Portuguese and Spanish specifically to understand their enemies. Mangas spoke both fluently. He used this knowledge not only to negotiate, but to listen to soldiers' conversations, intercept messages, and even spread disinformation. It was military intelligence at its most primitive and most effective. But then, in 1846, a new player entered the stage: the United States. The Mexican-American War brought the U.S. Army into Apache territory. At first, neither the Americans nor the Apache knew quite what to make of each other. Mangas, ever pragmatic, saw an opportunity. The Americans were fighting the Mexicans, the same Mexicans who had massacred his family. The enemy of my enemy, Mangas reasoned, could be useful. He approached American commanders with a surprising proposal. The Apache would not interfere with the American military advance through their territory. In return, the Americans would ignore Apache attacks on Mexican settlements. General Stephen Kearny, commander of U.S. forces in the Southwest, was impressed by Mangas. In his journal, Kearny described the Apache leader as the most intelligent and impressive Indian I have ever encountered. He speaks 3 languages, understands military strategy, and negotiates like a European diplomat. For a few years, the arrangement worked. The Americans conquered Mexican territory with relative ease, partly because the Apache did not attack them. Mangas continued his campaign against the Mexicans, now without worrying about another army on his land. But the Americans, like the Spanish and Mexicans before them, made a fatal mistake. They began breaking their promises. After the war, American settlers poured into Apache territory. Miners searching for gold, ranchers seeking land, entrepreneurs building roads. The U.S. government signed treaties guaranteeing Apache lands, then ignored them whenever it became convenient. Mangas tried to negotiate, tried to preserve peace, but in 1861, something happened that changed everything once again. A young, ambitious American lieutenant named George Bascom accused Cochise, Mangas's son-in-law and leader of the Chiricahua Apache, of kidnapping a white child. Cochise denied the crime and offered to help find the child. Bascom refused to believe him. Bascom invited Cochise to a negotiation at his camp. When Cochise arrived with his family to demonstrate good faith, Bascom attempted to arrest them all as hostages. Cochise escaped by cutting through the tent wall with a knife. But his family, his brother, his nephews, were captured. Bascom demanded the return of the allegedly kidnapped child in exchange for the hostages. Cochise did not have the child because he had never taken her. It was an impossible standoff. What followed became known as the Bascom Affair, and it ignited one of the most brutal wars in American history. Cochise captured several Americans as counter-hostages and proposed an exchange. Bascom, bound by rigid military orders and unwilling to admit he was wrong, refused. Cochise killed his captives. Bascom hanged the Apache prisoners, including Cochise's brother. The Apache War was now officially declared, and this time it would be fought to the death. Mangas Coloradas, now in his 60s, joined Cochise. Together, the 2 most feared leaders in the American Southwest declared open war on the United States. This time, there would be no negotiations, no truces, no forgiveness. Between 1861 and 1863, the American Southwest became a nightmare for anyone who was not Apache. Mangas Coloradas and Cochise coordinated a campaign of terror so effective that the U.S. Army seriously considered abandoning the entire territory. These were not random attacks by savages, as American propaganda liked to portray them. This was total war, conducted with surgical precision. The Apache operated a communication system using mirrors and smoke signals capable of transmitting complex messages across hundreds of miles. When an American patrol left a fort, the Apache knew within minutes. When a settler caravan entered Apache territory, warriors were alerted before the travelers even made camp. It was total surveillance, and the US Army had no answer for it. Lieutenant John Cremony, who served in Arizona during that period, wrote something in his memoirs that perfectly captures the psychological terror of the Apache War. You never saw them until it was too late. You could have 50 men, armed to the teeth, alert and experienced. It didn't matter. If the Apache decided to strike, you would be dead before you could shout for help. Cremony described a specific attack he witnessed in 1862. An army supply column, 25 soldiers, 12 wagons, 40 horses, was crossing a wide open valley. Lookouts were posted in every direction. The soldiers were alert, weapons ready. The Apache attacked from the sun, literally. They waited until the sun was positioned precisely to blind anyone looking in their direction. Then they charged in total silence, the horses' hooves wrapped in leather to muffle the sound. By the time the soldiers finally saw them, the Apache were less than 30 meters away. The fight lasted less than 3 minutes. 18 soldiers were killed. Every horse was taken. Half the wagons were burned. The Apache vanished into the hills before reinforcements could arrive. Cremony and the 7 survivors walked 16 kilometers back to the fort. He later wrote, "I fought in the Mexican Wars. I faced Texas bandits. But never in all my military life did I feel the kind of terror I felt in that valley. It was like fighting ghosts that killed." Apache tactics were so effective that the US Army began studying them formally. Officers sent detailed reports to Washington describing combat methods that challenged everything they thought they knew about warfare. The Apache did not simply attack and flee. They turned pursuits into death traps. When soldiers gave chase, Apache warriors deliberately left tracks that were too easy to follow. That alone should have been a warning, but military arrogance and the thirst for revenge drove soldiers forward anyway. The trail always led into a narrow canyon or a rocky pass, and once the military column was fully committed with no room to maneuver, the Apache struck from above. Arrows and rocks rained down from the cliffs. Soldiers fell from their horses. Panic spread. And when the survivors finally tried to retreat, they discovered the exit blocked by another group of warriors. It was a methodical massacre. General James Carleton, commander of the Military Department of New Mexico, admitted something in an 1862 report that no military officer liked to acknowledge. The Apache are the most effective warriors this army has ever faced. Man for man, they are superior to us in nearly every tactical aspect relevant to this war. But Carleton was also ruthless and unyielding. He decided that if he could not defeat the Apache in open battle, he would use other methods. He began targeting Apache water sources, poisoning wells, destroying natural reservoirs, burning food-gathering areas. The strategy was simple: force the Apache to negotiate through sheer necessity. It was a scorched earth policy, and slowly it began to work. It was in this context, in January of 1863, that Mangas Coloradas made his one fatal mistake. He trusted the word of a white man. Mangas was nearly 70 years old. He was tired. He had fought for decades, and he began to consider that perhaps, just perhaps, he could negotiate a peace that would protect his people. He sent messengers to Fort McLean stating that he wished to negotiate. General Joseph West guaranteed his safety, promised honest talks, swore on the honor of the US Army that Mangas would be treated as a respected leader. It was the same promise the Mexicans had made at Santa Rita del Cobre 26 years earlier, but Mangas, weary and hopeful, chose to believe. He went to the fort with a small escort. He was initially treated with respect. He was led to a tent to rest before negotiations began. Then, in the middle of the night, soldiers entered the tent. They heated their bayonets in the fire until they were red hot. and tortured Mangas Coloradas for hours, burning his feet and legs with the scorching metal. When Mangas finally reacted to the torture, rising and trying to defend himself, the soldiers opened fire. They later claimed he attempted to escape. He was shot multiple times at point-blank range, but the desecration did not end there. That same night, while Mangas's body was still warm, an army physician named David Sturm decapitated him. He boiled the head to remove the flesh and sent the skull to an Eastern phrenological museum, where racist scientists measured Apache skulls to prove theories of racial inferiority. When the Apache learned what had been done to Mangas Coloradas, the betrayal, the torture, the mutilation, something changed forever. Any hope of negotiated peace died with him. The Apache War became even more brutal. Cochise swore vengeance, not only for Mangas's death, but for the dishonor. Among the Apache, mutilating a body was one of the gravest crimes imaginable. It prevented the soul from finding peace in the afterlife. What the US Army did to Mangas was a declaration. There would be no honor, no respect, no humanity in this war. So the Apache responded in kind. Over the next 10 years, Cochise led a campaign of vengeance that killed hundreds of settlers and soldiers. He was more cautious than Mangas, more patient, but just as relentless. He did not attack blindly. Every action had strategic purpose, but while Cochise fought in Arizona, another Apache name was beginning to emerge from the shadows, a name that would become the most famous and the last of the great Apache war leaders, Geronimo. Geronimo was not his birth name. He was born Goyathle, meaning the one who yawns. It was a peaceful, almost humorous name. But in 1858, Mexican soldiers massacred his entire family. His mother, his wife, his 3 young children, while he was away from camp negotiating supplies. When Geronimo returned and found their mutilated bodies, something broke inside him in a different way. He did not seek vengeance alone. He sought total annihilation of anyone who represented Mexican or American power. His new name came from a battle against Mexican soldiers, where he killed so many men, so quickly and so ferociously that they began screaming, "Geronimo!" an invocation of Saint Jerome, begging for divine protection. The name stuck. Geronimo was different from Mangas and Cochise. He was not a natural political leader, not a diplomat. He was a pure warrior, and possibly the most effective the Apache ever produced. Stories spread that he was nearly supernatural, that he could predict enemy movements, that bullets could not touch him, that he could walk for days without water. Many of these stories were exaggerations, but not all. Geronimo truly possessed an extraordinary ability to read terrain and anticipate enemy behavior. He seemed to think 3 moves ahead of every pursuer. His physical endurance was legendary. Even in his 50s, he could ride over 100 kilometers in a single day, fight a battle, and vanish before dawn. But perhaps his greatest talent was more subtle. He understood fear, not just how to create it, but how to weaponize it. One of Geronimo's methods was deliberately leaving survivors, not out of mercy, but strategy. A soldier who survives a traumatic Apache attack does not return to his fort ready for revenge. He returns broken, spreading terror that infects the morale of everyone around him. The US Army began experiencing serious desertion problems in units fighting the Apache. Soldiers slipped away at night, preferring imprisonment for desertion over another patrol in Apache territory. In 1872, the US government finally negotiated a temporary truce with Cochise. It was not an American victory, it was mutual exhaustion. Cochise was around 60 years old and ill. The army had lost thousands of men and obscene sums of money trying to control a territory roughly the size of France. The truce lasted 2 years. Cochise died in 1874 at age 64 of natural causes, a rarity among Apache war leaders. His warriors buried him in a secret location that has never been revealed. To this day, no one knows where Cochise's remains lie. With his death, the last generation of great Apache leaders was fading, but Geronimo remained, and he had no intention of stopping. During the 1880s, Geronimo became public enemy #1 of the United States. More than 5,000 American soldiers were actively hunting him. Nearly 1/5 of the entire US Army dedicated to capturing a single man and his 40 warriors. 40 warriors holding back 5,000 soldiers. Let that sink in. The expeditions sent to capture Geronimo were military tragicomedies. Soldiers got lost in the desert. They died of dehydration. They were attacked and killed without ever seeing their attackers. On the rare occasions they managed to track Geronimo to a camp, they discovered he had already left, sometimes only minutes earlier. It was like trying to grab smoke with your hands. General George Crook, considered one of the finest American officers of his time, spent years hunting Geronimo. Crook was different from most commanders. He respected the Apache, studied their tactics, and tried to learn from them. He recruited Apache scouts to track Geronimo. That worked better than anything before it, because only an Apache could truly track another Apache. And still, Geronimo was always one step ahead. He knew the scouts personally. Many were relatives or old friends. He understood how they thought. And he laid false trails, specifically designed to mislead them. In 1886, after years of pursuit, Geronimo finally agreed to surrender. But not because he had been defeated in battle. He surrendered because the last free Apache women and children were starving, because there was nowhere left to run, because he was nearly 60 years old and exhausted. The surrender took place at Skeleton Canyon, on the border between the United States and Mexico. Geronimo arrived with only 16 warriors, the last of his band. General Nelson Miles, who had replaced Crook, promised that Geronimo and his people would be sent to a reservation in Arizona where they could live in peace. It was another lie. Geronimo and all the Apache who surrendered were placed on trains and sent to Florida, clear across the continent. They were held as prisoners of war. Families were separated. Children were sent to forced assimilation schools where they were forbidden to speak Apache or practice any aspect of their culture. Geronimo spent the final 23 years of his life as a prisoner. He was displayed at world's fairs as a curiosity. He rode in parades. He was photographed selling autographs for 25 cents. The great warrior who had terrified 2 national armies was turned into entertainment for tourists. He died in 1909 at the age of 79 from pneumonia. Drunk and alone, having fallen from his horse on a cold night. His last words, recorded by an army doctor, were, "I should never have surrendered. I should have fought until I was the last man alive." But here is the truth history books usually omit. The Apache were not defeated. They were exhausted. They were betrayed. They were victims of systematic genocide. For 300 years, European colonial empires and later the United States Army, the most powerful military force of its time, tried to conquer Apache territory. Millions of dollars were spent. Tens of thousands of soldiers were deployed. Hundreds of expeditions were launched. And still, the Apache resisted. Not only resisted, they dominated. They made seasoned generals look foolish. They turned veteran soldiers into men trembling with fear. They forced 2 nations to completely rethink how war was fought. The end of the Apache did not come through military defeat. It came through demographic attrition, forced starvation, systematic betrayal, and deliberate genocide. The US Army did not win because it was better at war, but because it had limitless resources and no moral restraints. Yet the Apache legacy survived. Today, the United States military teaches Apache tactics in its elite schools. Rangers and special forces study Apache warfare as a model of perfect guerrilla combat. The camouflage, silent movement, and ambush techniques developed by the Apache form the foundation of modern military training. During World War II, the Apache once again entered military history. Apache code talkers used their language to create unbreakable codes that helped the Allies win the war. The same language the US government had tried to erase through forced assimilation schools ended up saving thousands of American lives. It is ironic and deeply tragic. The descendants of Geronimo, Cochise, and Mangas Coloradas still live today in reservations in Arizona and New Mexico. The Apache population never fully recovered from genocide. From tens of thousands in the 17th century, there are now roughly 60,000 Apache worldwide, but they are still here, against all odds. Against centuries of attempted extermination, the Apache survived, and their story, the real story, not the sanitized version taught in classrooms, must be told. Because the Apache were not savages fighting civilization. They were people defending their land, their families, and their dignity against invaders who broke every promise and committed atrocities in the name of progress. They were warriors, yes. They were relentless, yes. But they were forced into that role by 300 years of betrayal, massacre, and genocide. The truth is simple. The Apache made entire armies disappear because they were absolute masters of warfare. Because they turned every inch of their land into a natural fortress. Because they fought with intelligence, courage, and tactical understanding centuries ahead of their enemies. And because they never, ever surrendered in their hearts, even when their bodies were forced to stop fighting. The silence of the desert was not deafening, because there was nothing there. It was deafening because it concealed the deadliest irregular army the Americas ever produced. Warriors who needed no uniforms, no formal training, no bureaucratic chains of command. They had only the land, their skill, and their absolute refusal to accept domination. And for 3 centuries, that was enough to make empires tremble. Colonel Bernard Cross learned that lesson on a September afternoon in 1861. And he learned something else as well. There are peoples who cannot be conquered by force, only destroyed, and destruction is not the same as victory. The Apache proved that, and their story remains as testimony to courage, resistance, and the human refusal to accept the unacceptable. They were the invisible terror of the desert, and they earned every ounce of that terror, because it was all that stood between survival and erasure. If this story moved you, don't let it end here. The Apache fought not to be forgotten, and you are now part of that living memory. Like this video so more people can learn the truth history tried to silence. Subscribe to the channel to continue this deep journey into the real, raw, and forgotten stories of peoples who stood against empires. And write in the comments, "The desert remembers." Every comment keeps this history alive. Every return strengthens this